Mrs. Thibodeau, my name is Sandra Park, head of legal for Southern Foods International. We've just discovered that the contract signed with Marcus Thibodeau has a serious problem. Product manufactured from that formula is generating mass complaints from distributors. And we need to speak with you, not your son, about who actually owns that recipe. That sentence, from a woman with a cold, precise New York voice, came through the phone on Friday morning, March 14th. But to understand why I was smiling when I heard it, I need to start from the beginning. From Monday of that week, when I walked into the kitchen and looked at the small wooden shelf in the corner of the wall. The shelf was empty. The green-covered notebook, the notebook my grandmother Celeste Thibodeau had begun writing in 1925, the notebook my mother had continued for 40 years, the notebook I had added to for 32 years with my own recipes and notes and memories, was gone. My name is Maria Evangeline Thibodeau. I am 60 years old. I opened Thibodeau Kitchen on Magazine Street in New Orleans when I was 28 years old, and I have run it for 32 years. The most important thing I own is not the shop, not the reputation, but that green notebook. The memory of 3 generations of Thibodeau women written in ink and spice and story. And my son had taken it. Marcus Thibodeau, 35 years old, living in my house for 3 years since his divorce, had left at 5 in the morning, earlier than usual. I didn't need evidence to know. I am his mother. I know his footsteps in the house. I know the way he closes doors. And I knew, with the instinct a mother never entirely loses, however grown her child becomes, that the previous night he had done something irreversible. But I didn't panic, didn't cry, didn't call him right away. I made a cup of chicory coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, and let my mind work in the way my grandmother Celeste had taught my mother and my mother had taught me. Before you season a dish, you taste it first. Before you react, you understand fully. Tuesday morning, March 4th, 7:30. The phone rang. Delphine Arsenault, my closest friend since we were 2 8-year-olds running the streets of Burgundy together. Maria, Delphine's voice was low and slightly unsteady. She is not an easily emotional woman. So when her voice trembles, what she's about to say is truly serious. Last night, Josephine called me. The girl couldn't stay quiet. She wanted you to know. She paused for a second. Marcus sold your recipe notebook to Southern Foods International, $1 million. He signed the contract last week, and he's planning to have you placed in a special care facility on Wednesday. He's been telling people you have memory loss and talk to yourself. I sat with that information for about 10 seconds. Outside the window, the New Orleans March morning was brightening. The damp smell of the Mississippi River, and somewhere far off the smell of toast from the bakery at the end of the block. A pair of pigeons walked along the neighbor's porch awning with the untroubled air of creatures who know nothing of human affairs. "What does the contract say about royalties?" I asked. The contract lists Marcus as the lawful heir and owner of the formula. The royalties go to his account. Thank you, Delphine. Thank Josephine for me. What are you going to do? What needs to be done? I said, the way I always do. I hung up and sat a few more minutes with the cooling coffee. Lawful heir and owner of the formula, while I was still alive and still sitting right here, fully lucid, fully legally competent. Some memory loss and talking to herself, to justify placing me in a facility where I'd have no legal voice. And here is what Marcus did not know. What Southern Foods International did not know. The green notebook contained the wrong recipe. 3 years ago, right after Marcus moved back in with me, I had a small premonition. Not a clear premonition about a specific event, just the feeling that a mother gets when she looks at her child and senses that not everything is where it belongs. Marcus was asking strange questions about the market value of Cajun seasoning formulas, about circumstances in which elderly people might need specialized medical care, about the legal rights of relatives to act on behalf of elderly people with cognitive issues. My friend Dorothy Cooper, a woman I'd known from the food business since 2005, had told me about 2 cases in her community. A woman who lost a family recipe to a nephew, an old man who lost control of his business because his daughter had falsified medical records. Dorothy said the sentence I thought about many times afterward. Maria, the best cook is the one who knows to hold back the most important ingredient until the very end of the meal. From that point, I prepared, not because I was certain Marcus would do something wrong, but because a Thibodeau woman knows that preparation is never wasted. I took out the green notebook and adjusted one ingredient in the most important Cajun sauce recipe, the formula that people lined up to buy every day at Thibodeau Kitchen. The adjustment was small, subtle, barely noticeable at home scale. I changed the ratio between black pepper and white pepper in the core spice blend. In a small pot, cooked fresh and served immediately, the difference is almost imperceptible. But in an industrial production line with high temperature pasteurization and sealed canning, that imbalance amplifies many times over. The product turns unpleasantly bitter after 48 hours. Not harmful to health, but completely unsaleable. The green notebook that Marcus took contained that altered recipe. The correct recipe lived in my head and in a second notebook, smaller, Bordeaux red cover, locked in the second drawer of the old spice cabinet. A drawer with its own separate lock that Marcus never knew existed, because the cabinet had always looked like it had only one drawer. Now I needed to do one thing before Wednesday arrived, call Celeste Tran. Wednesday, March 5th, 10 in the morning. Marcus arrived with 2 people. The man in a dark blue suit carrying a black briefcase introduced himself as Patterson, attorney. The pale-shirted woman with her hair pulled back was Rodriguez, a cognitive health assessment specialist, according to Marcus. Mom, Marcus said, his voice gentle and slow in the way people use when speaking to someone they consider no longer sharp. We just want to make sure you get the best possible care. Miss Rodriguez will have a little conversation with you. Please sit down, I said, calmly. I had already made 3 cups of coffee. I knew they were coming. Josephine had messaged Delphine, and Delphine had messaged me the previous evening. Patterson set his briefcase on the table and began pulling out papers. Mrs. Thibodeau, we have some documents related to long-term care arrangements. Given the cognitive health condition that Mr. Marcus has described, I know what you came here to do, I said, gently interrupting, and I know where the recipe notebook went. I looked at Marcus. Is there anything you'd like to say to me first? He didn't look me in the eye. That answer I already knew. All right, I said. I stood up, unhurried, composed, walked to the bedroom and picked up the telephone. Celeste, they're here. I need you. 15 minutes, Celeste Tran said, and I heard the sound of a chair pushing back in the background. I returned to the living room. Patterson looked at me with the mild surprise of someone who hadn't expected that kind of initiative. Rodriguez was holding a clipboard and writing. Marcus stood at the door, eyes aimed elsewhere. My attorney is on her way, I announced. You're welcome to wait or to step outside. I'd suggest waiting. It saves everyone's time. To understand why the Green Notebook was not simply a cookbook, you need to know where the story began, and with whom. My grandmother, Celeste Thibodeau, was born in 1908 in the Treme neighborhood of New Orleans, the oldest African-American and Creole neighborhood in the country, a place where, even in the darkest periods of Southern history, people maintained their own space of culture, music, and food. Celeste's mother, I called her Grand-Mère Maëva, was descended from people who had come from Saint-Domingue to Louisiana in the early 19th century. Grand-Mère Maëva carried spice knowledge whose roots reached further back. From West Africa, from the women who had been brought to the New World against their will, but who had carried in their memory things that could not be stolen away. Food was the last thing people could take from you when they had already taken everything else. Grandmother Celeste began the notebook in 1925, when Grandmère Maeva started to fail. Not dry record-keeping, she wrote with feeling and story, with marginal notes like, "Add to this when I think of the summer of 1918," or "This recipe existed before Grandmère was born, don't know its origins, but know it's right." The notebook was a family's memoir told through food. My mother, Aurore Thibodeau, received the notebook from Celeste and continued it for 40 years. She added recipes she had developed herself. How to make a chocolate dark roux, how to blend the shrimp seasoning mixture, how to make the herb marinade for duck. Every new page carried a date and sometimes a brief note about the circumstances. 1960, Hurricane Betsy season. Cooking on charcoal because the power went out. When my mother died in 2007, lung cancer, 6 months from diagnosis to death, she placed the notebook directly in my hands. "Maria," she said, in a voice already weakened but still clear, "this is not a cooking instruction manual. This is the book of our women. Keep it the way you'd keep their names." And I kept it. For 17 years I added to it, including the Cajun sauce recipe that took me 12 years to perfect, combining Celeste's tradition with a modern understanding of flavor balance. That is the recipe people lined up to buy at Thibodeau Kitchen every day. The recipe that Southern Foods International paid $1 million to acquire, and the recipe I had carefully adjusted before leaving it within reach of someone who wanted to take it. I opened Thibodeau Kitchen at 28 years old, in 1992, in a small rented space on Magazine Street. The startup capital was $7,000, $3,000 saved from 6 years of teaching in the 9th Ward public schools, $4,000 pooled together by family and community in the Louisiana Creole tradition. A community investing in one of its own, with the belief that person would do the right thing. The early years weren't easy. Magazine Street in the early 1990s was a mixed strip. Auto repair shops, laundromats, small local businesses crowded between deteriorating buildings. My first customers were neighbors and people who remembered the Thibodeau name from when my mother had sold food at the French market. Step by step, customer by customer, the name Thibodeau Kitchen began to carry its own meaning. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 nearly erased everything. The shop flooded badly, damaged for weeks before it could operate again. But the Treme and Magazine community helped each other the way only people who have survived a disaster together can. Neighbors came and cleaned up without needing to be paid. Longtime customers placed advance orders to help me rebuild my operating capital. Marcus was 16 at the time. He helped me clean, haul, scrub floors for 2 solid weeks. I remember the image of that tall, thin 16-year-old pushing a barrel of dirty water outside and looking back at the shop with a look that was both exhausted and resolute. "You're not giving up, are you, Mama?" he said then. "Celeste's great-granddaughter doesn't give up." Back then, I believed him. I believed that 16-year-old pushing a barrel of dirty water in the September Louisiana heat. But people are not fixed at a single moment. They change, and sometimes they change in directions you can't predict, even having watched them their whole life. Marcus Thibodeau, he carries my family name because his father left when Marcus was 3 and never came back, grew up in the kitchen of Thibodeau Kitchen, the way I had grown up in my mother's kitchen. I taught him everything. Not because I wanted him to follow my trade. I never pushed anyone to follow my work, because food only tastes right when it's made with love, not obligation. But because food was my family's language, and I wanted him to know that language. To recognize when the onions were golden enough, to understand why you have to stir a roux without stopping, to know what makes the smell of a pot of gumbo the smell of home. Marcus learned well as a child. Skilled hands, a keen nose. By 15, 16, He could execute most of the basic dishes on his own without my standing there guiding him. But when he went to LSU to study business and came back, something had shifted. Not entirely bad at first. He had become more practical, had learned to think in figures and strategy. But when he talked about Thibodeau Kitchen, I heard in his voice not love of the craft, but the calculation of someone assessing an asset sitting in hands that hadn't fully exploited its potential. Mom, do you know what your Cajun sauce recipe is worth if you licensed it to a major company? He asked that around 2020, when he was working as a marketing manager for a small New Orleans food company. Not as much as it's worth staying in Thibodeau hands, I said. He didn't argue, but I saw in his eyes the disagreement. After his 2021 divorce, Marcus came back to live with me. And Josephine, his ex-wife, told me afterward that the main cause was money. Marcus wanted to earn more, wanted to live in a way his actual income didn't allow, and often talked about big plans that never materialized. I let him stay because he was my son, because I believe people learn from hard periods, because I hoped that closeness again might pull him back towards something more real than his dreams about money. But during those 3 years, small signs accumulated. Questions growing increasingly specific about the shop's finances. Times he was in the kitchen not to cook, but to photograph. Late evenings without explanation. And particularly when he began asking about the right to make medical decisions on behalf of an elderly person with cognitive impairment. I was not someone losing her memory or failing to recognize what I was seeing. I was simply a mother who didn't want to believe what she was watching in the child she had raised with her whole life. In 2022, I met Dorothy Cooper at a local food fair in Baton Rouge. Dorothy ran a food business in Lafayette, a 62-year-old woman with practical eyes and 20 years of commercial experience. Maria, she said, after I gave her a brief account of my worries, I know 2 cases like that in my community. A woman who lost a family recipe to a nephew. A man who lost control of his business because someone falsified medical records. She looked at me. You can't stop them from trying, but you can control what they actually manage to get. The best cook is the one who knows to hold back the most important ingredient until the very end of the meal, Dorothy said. They think they're getting everything, but you're the one who decides what they actually walk away with. I went home and thought for 3 days. Then I did 2 things. The first, I took out the green notebook and adjusted the Cajun sauce recipe, changed the ratio between black pepper and white pepper in the core spice blend. Negligible at home scale, but sufficient to ruin an entire batch in a high-temperature industrial production line. The second, I bought a small Bordeaux red notebook and wrote into it the correct recipe, the complete, unaltered version. That notebook was locked in the second drawer of the Old Spice cabinet, a drawer with its own separate lock that Marcus never knew existed. I wasn't certain Marcus would do anything. I only knew that if something happened, I wanted the most important part in a safe place. And now, sitting looking at the empty shelf and holding my cooling coffee, I knew that preparation had arrived at the moment it was needed. After rebuilding the shop in 2006, I decided not just to restore what had been damaged, but to expand in a direction I'd been thinking about for years. Alongside the jarred products, I began teaching cooking on weekends. Not formal classes with a rigid schedule, but Saturday afternoon sessions in the shop kitchen. 10 people maximum, learning by doing. Those sessions became the thing I valued most in the profession. Not because they brought in much money. The tuition barely covered ingredient costs. But because through each session, I saw what Grandmother Celeste and my mother had seen in me when I was small. The moment when someone first understood why roux has to be stirred without stopping. The moment they tasted and realized that flavor balance was something they could learn even if they'd thought before that they couldn't. In 15 years, From 2006 to 2021, I taught more than 200 people in my small kitchen. Vietnamese, Mexican, German, Japanese, all of them had come to New Orleans for different reasons and stayed partly because of the food. And I taught them not only technique but story, why each recipe had its history, where this spice came from, why this flavor combination appeared in Louisiana culinary culture. Marcus joined a few sessions as a child, not as a student, but as the owner's kid, sitting in the corner of the kitchen watching. He used to tell friends he had grown up in Mom's kitchen, which was not wrong physically. But growing up in a kitchen and understanding a kitchen are two different things. In 2015, when Thibodeau Kitchen was featured in Saveur magazine in a piece about family food brands that survived Katrina in New Orleans, I received more offers than I could handle. Restaurants wanting bulk orders, distributors wanting to bring the products into supermarket chains, a Japanese food company wanting to license production for the Asian market. I declined most of them. Not because I didn't want to grow, but because I knew my limits. I was a person who made real food in a real kitchen, not someone who managed a distribution chain. What I agreed to do was what I could do while still preserving the quality and meaning of the product. Marcus, when he learned of those offers, didn't understand why I turned them down. "Mom, you're missing an incredible opportunity," he said. "With the right distribution network, Thibodeau Kitchen could become a national brand." Thibodeau Kitchen is the name of 3 generations of women in this family, I said, not the name of a national distribution chain. He said nothing more, but I saw that he disagreed, and that the disagreement didn't disappear. It only waited for a more suitable moment to resurface. After speaking with Dorothy Cooper at the Baton Rouge Food Fair in 2022, I went home and thought for 3 days. Not chaotic thinking, but orderly thinking in the way I tend to approach complex problems in the kitchen. Identify what I know for certain, what I don't know, and what I need to do to learn more. What I knew for certain. Marcus was paying more attention to the recipe notebook than usual. He was asking questions about legal rights that he had no legitimate reason to ask. He had financial difficulties he wasn't being straight with me about. What I didn't know, what specifically he was planning to do, if anything. Whether this was a real plan or just curiosity I was overreading. And the hardest question, if I confronted him directly about my concerns, would it change anything, or would it only push him to act sooner? I didn't confront Marcus directly. That was a conscious decision, though not an easy one. My reasoning at the time. If I asked, and he really had no plan, I'd have damaged the mother-son relationship unnecessarily. If he did have a plan, and I asked, he might become more careful, and I'd lose my chance to prepare a proper defense. Looking back now, I'm not certain that decision was right or wrong. Perhaps an honest conversation earlier could have changed something, perhaps not. What I know is that I did what I could with the information and circumstances I had at the time. Perfection in difficult decisions is a standard no one, not even the most experienced cook, fully meets. What I have no doubt about, keeping 2 notebooks, adjusting the recipe in the one that could be taken, and building the legal plan with Celeste. Those things were right and necessary, whatever Marcus's intentions turned out to be. Celeste Tran arrived at 10:20, exactly as promised. A 48-year-old Vietnamese Louisiana woman, short black hair, wearing a pale blue suit jacket, carrying a thin document portfolio and the calm of someone who has handled enough legal situations to no longer be surprised by anything. I had known Celeste since 2015 through a mutual friend in the New Orleans women's business community. She specialized in intellectual property law and commercial disputes, exactly the field I needed. Celeste stood in the living room doorway, looked at Patterson, looked at Rodriguez, looked at Marcus, then looked at me. She needed no further explanation. She already knew the situation from the phone call the previous evening. "Mr. Patterson," Celeste said, her voice even but clear, "I am the attorney representing Mrs. Maria Thibodeau. I'd like to see all documents you've brought with you, right now." Patterson looked at Marcus. Marcus gave a small nod. Over the next 20 minutes, Celeste read through each piece of paper Patterson placed on the table. A cognitive health assessment file signed by a doctor I had never met, a petition to place me in a long-term care facility, and a power of attorney for Marcus to represent me in legal and financial decisions. The physician who signed this file, Celeste said when she finished, is named Graham Whitfield. His Louisiana medical license expired in November of last year. She set the paper down and looked straight at Patterson. "You are presenting invalid medical documentation to have my client, a person in full legal competency, placed in a care facility without her consent. That is a violation of Louisiana law under Section 1493.3 on elder abuse." She turned to Rodriguez. "And if you proceed with any assessment based on this invalid medical record, you are placing your own professional license at serious risk." The living room went quiet. Rodriguez lowered the clipboard. "I'm asking all of you to leave my client's home right now," Celeste said. "And Mr. Patterson, I'll be contacting the Louisiana State Bar regarding your conduct in this matter." Patterson gathered his papers. Rodriguez stood up. Marcus remained at the door. "Marcus," I said, as he was preparing to follow Patterson and Rodriguez out. I stood up, and for the first time that day, I looked at my son with honest, direct eyes. "You need to find somewhere else to live on today." He looked at me. For the first time since he had walked into the house that morning, he looked me straight in the eyes. I saw in his face not remorse, but calculation. He was assessing whether there was another path. There wasn't. He left with Patterson and Rodriguez. Thursday, March 6th. I arrived at Celeste Tran's office on Carondelet Street at 9 in the morning. The office was small and orderly, with legal bookshelves and a painting of the French market on the wall. The kind of office that says the person working there doesn't need to impress with interior design, only with results. "First, the legal situation," Celeste began after I sat down. "The contract Marcus signed with Southern Foods International has a fundamental flaw. He signed as owner of the formula. But that formula isn't his. You created and have owned that recipe across 32 years of Thibodeau Kitchen's operation. The notebook is a physical asset, and the recipe in it is intellectual property belonging to you, not Marcus. So the contract can be voided because the person who signed it had no right to sign. But to do that, we need to prove that you are the true owner of the recipe." Celeste looked at me. "Do you have any evidence? Ingredient invoices, product labels with the recipe name on them, any documents linking you to the recipe over many years?" 32 years of invoices, product labels, and shop photographs, I said, all stored on the computer and in filing drawers. And more importantly, I paused. "Celeste, I need to tell you about the Bordeaux red notebook." I told her everything. Celeste listened without interrupting, only occasionally making quick notes. When I finished describing the pepper ratio change in the green notebook, Celeste set her pen down and looked at me. "You did this before Marcus took the notebook?" 2 years before he took it." Celeste was quiet for a moment. Then she smiled, brief, genuine. "Southern Foods International is manufacturing at scale with a flawed recipe. They'll discover that when they receive complaints from distributors, and at that point, they'll need you, not Marcus." "That's right," I said. "How far do you want to take this?" Celeste asked. "Void the contract and recover the notebook? Or do you have other objectives?" I thought about the question. I want ownership of the recipe established clearly and legally. I want the recipe used properly, possibly in a partnership with a reputable company, but directly with me, not through Marcus. and I want this not to happen to anyone else. Celeste nodded. Then we wait another week. I predict Southern Foods will contact you before the end of next week. In Thursday's meeting, Celeste and I didn't only discuss the legal situation. We laid out a detailed plan, what needed to be done, in what order, with what specific goals. Celeste explained 3 scenarios that could unfold. The first, Southern Foods. International had done careful legal due diligence before signing and knew the contract with Marcus was problematic, but signed anyway, hoping I wouldn't have enough resources to fight. In this case, they would not easily cancel the contract and would need stronger legal pressure. The second, they had not done proper due diligence and genuinely believed Marcus had the right to sign. In this case, when they learned the truth, they might cooperate on a resolution because they would also be victims of fraud. The third, the product fails, which I knew would happen, and they need the correct recipe more than they need to maintain the contract with Marcus. In this case, they would reach out to me proactively. I'm betting on scenario 3, I said. Why? Because I know exactly what I put in that notebook. At industrial production scale, the problem will appear within the first 2 weeks of production. I explained the technical mechanism to Celeste. Why the wrong pepper ratio would produce bitterness after pasteurization. They'll catch the defect before the product reaches consumers or immediately after. Celeste listened, took notes, then said, Maria, you've thought through all of this in a very systematic way. How long have you been preparing for this situation? I prepared the recipe in the notebook 2 years ago, I said. But I started having concerns in 2022 when I spoke with Dorothy Cooper. And actually, I was probably worried before that. I just didn't want to admit it to myself. Why not? Because he's my son. And when you don't want to believe something, you're very good at finding reasons not to believe it. Celeste nodded. You're not alone in that. Most of the elder financial abuse cases I handle share one common thread. The victim saw the signs but didn't want to believe them. She looked at me. What matters is what you did with what you saw. Even while not wanting to believe it, you prepared. Many people don't do that. In Thursday's meeting with Celeste, after we had talked through the legal situation and the path forward, she asked me a small question I hadn't expected. Maria, do you want to find out who signed that medical record? Dr. Graham Whitfield with the expired license. How did Marcus find him? I thought about it. I want to know, to make sure he doesn't do the same thing to someone else. But I don't want this case to become more complicated than necessary. I understand. Celeste made a note. I'll report the falsified medical file to the Louisiana Medical Board. That needs to be done regardless of whether you want to pursue legal action against that individual. And I'll send information to the state's Office of Elderly Affairs. Do that, I agreed. Not because I want to punish Marcus or Graham Whitfield or anyone. But because if this happened to me and I can prevent it from happening to someone else, that's what needs to be done. Celeste looked at me. You know, in 15 years of practicing law, I don't meet many clients who think about that. Most people, once their own situation is resolved, breathe a sigh of relief and don't look back. I grew up in Tremé, I said. There they teach you from the time you're small. When you've gotten through something hard, you have a responsibility to help other people through their hard things. Not because anyone requires it, but because that's how a community survives over time. From March 10th through March 14th, I ran the shop normally, cooked normally, lived my normal life. Delphine visited every day, not because she was worried about me, but because she wanted to sit in my kitchen and drink coffee while I worked, in the way that two close friends who have lived alongside each other for 50+ years do without needing to explain why. During that week, Southern Foods International began receiving complaints. I didn't learn this from their internal sources. I learned it from 2 different ones. Josephine, who still had some connections in the food business world from her marketing days, heard that Bayou Bell sauce, Southern Food's new product, was being returned by distributors in 3 states for off-standard flavor. And Delphine, whose niece ran a restaurant in Baton Rouge, heard from the niece's supplier that Bayou Bell sauce had just been pulled from the shelves of a Mississippi supermarket chain. Too bitter after 48 hours at industrial production temperatures. Exactly as I had predicted. I made another cup of coffee, cut a slice of leftover king cake from the day before, and continued with the day's work. Delphine looked at me with the quiet admiration of someone who has known me for 50-some years and still occasionally gets surprised. "You're not worried?" she asked. "About what?" I asked back. "About everything." I set down the cake knife and looked at my closest friend. "Delphine, I have known this Cajun sauce recipe since you and I were sitting at Grandmother Celeste's feet, watching her cook. I spent 12 years perfecting it. I've sold it every day for 32 years. And nobody takes that from me. Not Marcus, not Patterson, not Southern Foods International." She was quiet for a moment. "Grandmère Celeste would be proud of you." "I know," I said. "And my mother too. From March 6th through March 14th, I lived on the ordinary rhythm of life, opening the shop at 7 in the morning, closing at 6 in the evening, coming home to cook dinner for myself and sometimes having Delphine drop by. But not entirely ordinary. There was a small part of my mind that was always tracking, waiting for word from the informal network of acquaintances in the Louisiana food industry about the status of Bayou Bell sauce. And that part didn't have long to wait. Wednesday, March 12th, Josephine texted Delphine, "Heard Bayou Bell sauce is being sent back by distributors in 3 states for off-standard flavor. About 5,000 cases being held." Delphine forwarded it to me. I read it, nodded, and kept working in the kitchen. "You have nothing to say?" Delphine called from behind me, sitting at the small corner table with her coffee. "Exactly as predicted," I said. "You're not happy?" I thought about the question while continuing to stir the soup pot on the stove. I don't know what to call this feeling. Not happy in the sense of satisfaction. Not sad with pity for Marcus. Just, what is happening is right. When the right thing happens, people don't usually feel exhilarated. They just feel right. Delphine was quiet for a moment. "You sometimes say things that sound like philosophy." "I've been cooking for 40 years, I said. "Stand in front of a stove long enough and you naturally become philosophical." Exactly as Celeste had predicted. Friday, March 14th, at 9:30 in the morning, the phone rang. A New York number. "Mrs. Thibodeau, my name is Sandra Park, head of legal for Southern Foods International." The opening sentence I told you at the beginning of this story, the sentence that made me smile when I heard it. "We've just discovered that the contract we signed with Mr. Marcus Thibodeau has a serious problem," Sandra Park continued. "Product manufactured from that formula is generating mass complaints from distributors, and we need to speak with you, not your son, about who actually owns that recipe." "I am the actual owner of that recipe," I said. "And I have an attorney. My attorney will be in contact with your legal department." "Mrs. Thibodeau," Sandra Park's voice shifted. Less cold, more pragmatic. "We understand this situation is complicated. We want to find a solution that works for both sides. Distributors are holding back $3 million in product, and we need to resolve this as quickly as possible." "I understand," I said. "My attorney will be in contact with you today." I hung up and called Celeste immediately. "Southern Foods called," I said. "I know. They called me too this morning," Celeste said, and I heard in her voice a satisfaction being carefully contained. "They want to meet in person. Tuesday of next week at my office." "Good," I said. "Maria, they're in a much weaker position than they think they are. $3 million in returned product, A contract signed with someone who had no right to sign, and you're holding the real recipe they need. Celeste, I said, I want to work with them if they agree to my terms. I don't want them to go bankrupt over this. I just want the right thing done the right way. That's why I like working with you, Celeste said. Tuesday, March 18th, 10 in the morning. Celeste Tran's office on Carondelet Street. From Southern Foods International, Sandra Park, and a man who introduced himself as David Chen, Executive Vice President, together with their legal representative, a man named Harrison, about 10 years younger than Celeste, looking like he'd missed a lot of sleep. From my side, Celeste. And me. No Marcus. He was not invited, and even if he had been, there was nothing for him at this table. First, Celeste began, we'd like to establish some legal facts. The contract Southern Foods International signed with Marcus Thibodeau on February 27th is void, because the person who signed it had no authority to do so. The Cajun sauce recipe is intellectual property belonging to Maria Evangeline Thibodeau, the person who created, developed, and has owned that recipe for 32 continuous years. We have complete documentary evidence for this. Harrison looked at the paper in front of him. We acknowledge there were problems in our ownership verification process before signing the contract. That would be an understatement, Celeste interrupted calmly. But rather than focusing on who was wrong where, my client would like to propose a way forward. David Chen looked at me. For the first time since the meeting began, he looked me directly in the eye. Mrs. Thibodeau, personally, I'd like to hear from you. I placed my hands on the table and spoke plainly. Mr. Chen, Southern Foods International is manufacturing a product using the wrong recipe. I know that because I know exactly what changed in the notebook my son took, and what didn't change in my notebook. I looked at him squarely. I can give you the correct recipe, but only under a proper contract, directly between Southern Foods and me, with fair royalty terms, product quality control rights, and my name on the label. The conference room was quiet for a few seconds. And Marcus Thibodeau? Sandra Park asked. That's Southern Foods' problem with him, I said. You signed a contract with someone who had no right to sign. The legal consequences of that are between you and him, not my concern. David Chen exchanged a look with Sandra Park. Then he looked back at me. Mrs. Thibodeau, we're listening. The negotiation lasted 4 hours. Celeste and Harrison worked through each clause while David Chen sat and listened, occasionally asking questions. Sandra Park was quiet for most of it, but took careful notes. The terms I required and the terms agreed to. 1. A direct licensing contract between Maria Thibodeau and Southern Foods International, with no third-party involvement. 2. Royalties of 8% on actual retail sales. Not the wholesale price, but the final retail price. 3. The name Thibodeau to be retained on the product label with the notation family recipe since 1925. 4. Quality control rights. I'd have the right to request random product testing up to twice per year at Southern Foods' expense. 5. A 10-year contract with renewal provisions, not a permanent transfer. Southern Foods agreed to all terms. Not because they were generous, but because $3 million in returned product was sitting in warehouses, and every day of delay was additional loss. After the signatures were done, I took out the Bordeaux red notebook from the small cloth bag I had brought. I set it on the table in front of David Chen. This is the correct recipe, I said. The complete, unaltered version. Celeste will notarize a copy for you today. David Chen looked at the red notebook, then looked at me. You had this prepared in advance. 2 years in advance, I confirmed. He was quiet for a moment. Mrs. Thibodeau, I want to be honest with you. Our company did not follow proper due diligence procedures before signing the contract with Mr. Marcus. That was our error, and I think we were taken advantage of no less than you were. Possibly, I said. But now we have a proper contract. That's what matters most. Southern Foods International filed a civil lawsuit against Marcus Thibodeau in early April for commercial fraud, signing a contract as owner of property that did not belong to him. The $1 million in earnest money that Southern Foods had paid to Marcus was demanded back in full, plus damages from the defective product run. Patterson, the attorney Marcus had hired, withdrew from representation after learning the full picture of the case. Celeste had submitted a report about his conduct to the Louisiana State Bar, and Patterson was facing his own disciplinary proceedings. I didn't contact Marcus during that period. Not because I didn't still love him, I was still his mother, and that didn't change with any event. But because there are consequences people need to work through on their own path, and a parent's intervention at such a time rarely helps. Delphine asked me about it once when we were sitting on my back porch on an April afternoon, the porch that looked out on the small herb garden I use for my recipes. "Aren't you heartbroken?" "Yes," I said honestly. I am heartbroken. Not because of the property loss or the legal proceedings. I'm heartbroken because the 16-year-old who pushed a barrel of dirty water after Katrina became the man who sat at a table with a mental health evaluator and a lawyer trying to put his own mother in a care facility. I looked out at the garden. I don't know where I went wrong in how I raised him. Or perhaps I didn't go wrong anywhere. Sometimes people make choices that nobody else can explain or prevent. "You raised him alone since he was 3, Delphine said. "You did the best you could." "I know," I said. "And now he'll have to learn things I can't learn for him." In May, the court ruled in the civil case between Southern Foods International and Marcus Thibodeau. Marcus was ordered to repay the full $1 million in earnest money plus damages from the defective product run, totaling more than $2,800,000. Marcus had no assets sufficient to cover it. He lost his rented apartment, his car, and was in the process of negotiating a long-term repayment plan. I did not feel satisfaction when I heard that outcome. Not because I pitied Marcus. He had done what he did with full awareness and planning, but because the outcome, though legally correct, still left something sad in me. Like when a pot of soup burns and the smell of scorching stays in the air long after you've turned off the stove. 1 week after the verdict, Marcus called me. The first time since the day I had asked him to leave. I answered, "Mom?" His voice was different, no longer the calculating, even voice of the previous months, but the voice of someone genuinely exhausted. I don't know what to say except that I was wrong. Completely wrong. I sat in the kitchen with the phone, looking out the window. The May New Orleans afternoon was shifting toward the gold of late sun. "I'm listening," I said. "Keep going." I thought the recipe was just a business asset, property to be leveraged. I didn't understand. He stopped. I didn't understand that it was Grandmother Celeste's name, Grandmother Aurore's name, your name. I didn't understand that until it was too late. I sat quietly for a few seconds. Then I said, "Marcus, I won't tell you that what you did is all right or easily forgiven. But I will say this. If you truly understand what you just said, that is worth more than any sum of money in this story. Can you forgive me?" "Forgiveness is something that happens over time," I said. The sentence I had heard many people say and now finally understood the full meaning of. It's not something a person gives over the phone. But you're heading in the right direction if you truly understand what you just said. The 8% royalty clause in the contract with Southern Foods International came into effect from April, when Bayou Belle Sauce, remade with the correct recipe, returned to the market. This time with the label Thibodeau Family Recipe since 1925. The product sold well, not because of lavish marketing or an advertising campaign, but because the product genuinely tasted right, and the story behind the Thibodeau name had been written about in several local food publications. And New Orleans is a city where stories about food are always heard with particular attention. In June, I met with Celeste to discuss something I'd been thinking about since the beginning of all this. I want to establish a fund, I said, using part of the royalty income to support elderly people who are victims of financial abuse within their families. Not a large fund, but enough that they can access legal counsel when needed and not face those situations alone the way I nearly did. Celeste looked at me. The Elder Financial Justice Fund. Yes. I can help you set up the legal structure, Celeste said, and I want to volunteer free legal consultation for people who need it through the fund. Thank you, Celeste. No thanks needed. This is the right thing to do. The Elder Financial Justice Fund of Louisiana officially launched in June with a small event at Thibodeau Kitchen. Tables filled with dishes that my mother and grandmother Celeste and Grandmère Maeva had cooked over many generations, and New Orleanians of every age sitting around them eating and talking about food and about life. Delphine sat beside me throughout the event. And Josephine came. The girl who had called Delphine that night. The girl whose phone call had set the entire chain of events in motion. I held her and thanked her from the heart. You don't need to thank me, Josephine said. I only did the right thing. The most important ingredient, I told her, integrity. The first woman to contact the Elder Financial Justice Fund, the one Celeste told me about in an October phone call, was named Gloria Washington. 73 years old, living alone in Shreveport since her husband died in 2019. Her only son, named Darnell, was trying to convince her to sign paperwork so he could access her bank accounts under the pretext of protecting her from fraud. Celeste spoke with Gloria Washington for an hour. Then she called me and described it. She told me she knew something wasn't right, but didn't know what to do. She was afraid that if she refused Darnell, he'd stop coming to visit her. She was more afraid of loneliness than of losing the money. That sentence, more afraid of loneliness than of losing the money, stayed with me. That is what people who exploit the elderly understand and exploit. Not just money and assets, but the fear of loneliness that comes to those who have lost many relationships over the years and don't want to lose more. I asked Celeste to find out whether Gloria would like to speak with me. Not as a legal expert, but as someone who had been through a similar situation. Celeste asked. Gloria agreed. We talked on the phone for 45 minutes. I didn't offer legal advice. That was Celeste's area. I only told her my story, and I said to her what I had learned. The fear of loneliness is a real and normal feeling, but you don't need to let that fear become something other people use to control you. And if Darnell only comes to visit when you give him what he wants, then that isn't real affection. That's a transaction. Oh, you deserve more than that. Gloria Washington was quiet for about 10 seconds after that. Then she said, "Thank you. No one had put it to me that way before." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen and thought, this is why I started the fund. Not to handle legal cases. Celeste does that far better than I ever could. But so there would be someone that people like Gloria Washington could call and hear. I've been where you are, and I'm still standing. When Bayou Belle sauce returned to market in April with the Thibodeau family recipe since 1925 label, something unexpected happened. Longtime customers of Thibodeau Kitchen, people who had been buying my sauce for 30 years, began writing about the product on local social media. Not writing in the style of advertising, writing in the way New Orleanians do when they rediscover something familiar. That's it. That's the right smell. I remember buying from Mrs. Maria on Magazine Street when I was little. My mother used Thibodeau sauce every Sunday for gumbo. Knowing the original recipe is still in her hands is wonderful. New Orleans needs to hold on to things like this. Those comments moved me more than anything else in this entire story. Not because they helped sales or validated my decisions, but because they reminded me of something I had known since I was small, but sometimes forgot in the daily worries. Food is not only food, it's memory, community, the invisible thread that connects people across time and space. A woman named Claudette Moreau, 72 years old, living in Gentilly, came into my shop on a Saturday morning in June and said she'd been buying Thibodeau sauce since 1993, the year I first opened. "You know," Mrs. Claudette said while I was preparing her order, "when I heard what happened, I was so worried. I was afraid the Thibodeau name would be lost, that it wouldn't be yours anymore." "Grandmère Céleste didn't let that happen," I said. Mrs. Claudette smiled. She never let anything happen that she didn't agree to. I didn't know whether Mrs. Claudette had known Céleste personally or only knew of her through community story. But that sentence, "she never let anything happen that she didn't agree to," was something I carried in my head the rest of that day. That's right. And I am her granddaughter. After Marcus's phone call in May, Delphine asked me, "Are you going to forgive him?" I thought honestly about the question before answering. "I don't know," I said. Forgiveness is something that happens over time, not a decision a person makes in a single moment. Right now, I haven't forgiven in the full sense of the word. But I'm also not storing something in my chest, like a poison. Do you want to see him again? Someday, perhaps, when he has truly understood what he did. Not understood because a court ruled against him, but understood in a deeper sense. I looked out the kitchen window. But the mother-son relationship will be different now. It has to be. You can't go back to before everything happened and pretend nothing did. Is that a sad thing? Sad, I admitted. But sad doesn't mean wrong. Sometimes the right thing still carries sadness. Like when you have to cut away deceased growth to save a plant. What's left is smaller, but it lives. Delphine was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You're talking about your son and using plant metaphors. You are the strangest friend I've ever had." I laughed, the first time I'd laughed genuinely in many months. "I grew up in a kitchen," I said. "I only know metaphors about food and growing things." And Delphine laughed too, her laugh, full and warm in the Louisiana way, spreading through the kitchen and out through the window onto Magazine Street outside. New Orleans summer comes early. By June, it's hot and humid in the way that only those born here learn to live with quietly. I open the shop every morning at 7, make chicory coffee for the first customers, and begin a workday that has kept the same rhythm in my life for 32 years. In the months after everything settled, I thought often about the question people ask me. Where did I go wrong? And the honest answer is, I don't think I went wrong in how I raised Marcus. I taught him food and history and community. I showed him everything I knew about the craft. I was beside him through hard periods. The divorce, losing work, starting over. I gave him a roof when he needed it. What I might have done differently. Spoken more plainly about values and limits earlier. Instead of staying quiet when I noticed small signs, instead of convincing myself I was misreading things, I should have sat down with Marcus and said directly, "You're asking questions that worry me. I want to talk about that." Maybe that conversation would have changed nothing, but maybe it would have changed a great deal. I will never know the answer to that, and I have learned to live with not knowing. What I know for certain, Dorothy Cooper was right. The best cook is the one who knows to hold back the most important ingredient until the very end of the meal. And Céleste, my mother, and all the Thibodeau women had taught me that most important ingredient since I was small. Food is memory, family, the thread connecting those who are gone to those who remain. Nobody takes that from you, whether they get the notebook or not. I want to say more about the people who stood beside me during that time, because this story is not one person's story. Celeste Tran was not only a skilled attorney, she was someone who understood that cases like mine are not just legal disputes, but questions of dignity. She worked not only to win the case, but to ensure the outcome would have lasting meaning. And when I proposed the Elder Financial Justice Fund, she agreed without hesitation. Delphine Arsenault came to see me every day for 2 months, not because I asked her to, but because she is a true close friend in the fullest sense. Someone who understands that sometimes you don't need advice or solutions. You just need someone to sit there in the kitchen drinking coffee with you and not asking too many questions. Josephine, the girl who called Delphine that night, the person who set the entire chain of events in motion that led to my being protected, had no legal or emotional obligation to do what she did. She did it because she saw what was right and chose to do the right thing, even though it wasn't easy. In a world where people often speak of bystander silence, Josephine is the example of the opposite. And Dorothy Cooper, the Lafayette woman I met once at a food fair and never saw again. Her words had entirely changed how I handled this situation. Sometimes, one right sentence from the right person at the right moment is powerful enough to change the direction of everything. In October, I received a parcel from Southern Foods International, a small cardboard box with a return address at David Chen's Houston office. Inside were 3 boxes of the new Bayou Belle sauce and a handwritten note. Mrs. Thibodeau, we hope you're pleased with the product, and we hope this partnership is the beginning of a long-term relationship built on genuine respect. David Chen. I opened one box and tasted it. The flavor was right. Not exactly like cooking fresh in a small pot, because nothing can be exactly that when mass-produced, but right in the essential sense. The balance of spice and herbs, and that warmth at the back of the palate that Grandmother Celeste had called the soul of the sauce was still there. I called Celeste. The product's good. Wonderful, she said. And our fund received its first application last week. Who? A 73-year-old woman in Shreveport. Her son is trying to use falsified medical records to control her bank accounts. Celeste paused. I talked with her on the phone this morning. She said exactly what so many people in that situation say. I don't know what to do, and I don't know who can help me. Now she knows, I said. Now she knows, Celeste confirmed. I put down the phone and looked out the kitchen window. The October afternoon in New Orleans. The light beginning to angle. No longer the fierce heat of summer, but a hint of the slow autumn coming in the Louisiana way, where seasons never shift abruptly, but always slide gently from one state to another. I write these words on an evening in early November, sitting in the kitchen of Thibodeau Kitchen after I've cleaned up and prepared for the next day. On the stove, a pot of stock is simmering. I like to let stock go overnight, because when I open the shop in the early morning, that smell greets the first customers in a way that no air conditioning or background music can match. The Bordeaux red notebook sits on the table in front of me. The green notebook, the original with the adjusted recipe, Celeste is holding as part of the legal file. I don't need it back. I remember everything in it. Not because I have an exceptional memory, but because when you have done something with enough love for long enough, it becomes part of you in a way that no notebook can take away. There are things I want to say to anyone reading this story, not as lessons or a list to memorize, but as the words of a 60-year-old woman sitting in her kitchen on a November evening. The first is about documents. Dorothy Cooper was right. You can't stop someone from trying to take what you have, but you can control what they actually manage to get. Good legal documents, timely legal counsel, and knowing your rights. These things aren't weapons against family. They protect everyone, including those you love. The second is about silence. Looking back, one of my mistakes was staying silent too long about my real concerns. When you see a worrying sign in your relationship with a family member, speak up sooner, not to accuse, but to open a conversation. Silence resolves nothing. It only lets a problem grow in the dark. The third is about community. I didn't get through this situation alone. Delphine, Josephine, Dorothy Cooper, Celeste Tran. Each of them played an irreplaceable role. Community is not something you build in a crisis. It's something you build during ordinary years, through consistent kindness and honesty and being present when others need it. And when crisis arrives, that community is there. And fourth, the most important thing to me after 60 years in this story, the most important ingredient in life is integrity. Not intelligence, not talent, not connections or money. Integrity. What Grandmother Celeste embodied when she wrote her recipes with all the true story and circumstance behind them. What my mother embodied when she placed a notebook in my hands with the instruction to keep it the way you'd keep the names of your women. What Josephine embodied when she called Delphine, though no one required her to. What David Chen embodied when he acknowledged his company had been wrong and sought to make it genuinely right. Integrity doesn't protect you from being hurt. It doesn't prevent others from trying to take advantage of you. But it is what keeps you standing when everything around you collapses. It is what lets you look back and know that you acted right, and that knowing matters more than a great many other things. I turn down the flame under the stockpot, leaving it simmering in the warm darkness of my kitchen, and go to sit on the back porch in the New Orleans November night. Not too cold, not too warm, the perfect temperature that this city sometimes grants you as a reward after a long summer. I think about Grandmother Celeste and Grandmère Maeva and my mother. I think about the green notebook that started in 1925 and the Bordeaux red notebook sitting on the table in the kitchen. I think about the 73-year-old woman in Shreveport talking with Celeste about her situation and the others who will come after her through the Elder Financial Justice Fund. And I think this is how important things continue. Not by being held closed and secret, but by being shared with the right people at the right time in the right way. Grandmother Celeste shared with my mother. My mother shared with me. I will share not only the recipe, but everything the recipe represents. Patience, love of the work, and the small daily integrity that when added up over decades becomes something no one can take away. The stockpot simmers in the darkness of my kitchen. Magazine Street outside is going quiet for the night, and New Orleans continues to be New Orleans, the city of food and music and story, where people from different circumstances found ways to live together and create something that exists nowhere else. The most important ingredient in life is integrity. I have known that since I was 8 years old, sitting at Grandmother Celeste's feet watching her cook. It just took me 60 years to understand fully why.